Bursting onto the scene in 1991, Sonic completely changed the landscape of the video game industry. While Nintendo had absolutely dominated in sales in North America, Sonic took the slowly growing Sega Genesis/Mega Drive and made it a true competitor to Nintendo. If you grew up in the 90s like I did, the influence of Sonic was undeniable. At the daycare my mom would drop me off at while she exercised, these games were all anyone ever wanted to play. Outside of sometimes Super Mario World. I remember saving up my weekly allowances for roughly 6 months to a year so I could afford a Sega Genesis and Sonic 2. But what makes Sonic feel good to play? What made it spark, and how did it stand out in a sea of action platform games? First, I'll go over a little development history, and then we'll dive right into game design. At this point, it's pretty well known that the two founding fathers of Sonic, so to speak, were Yuji Naka, who came up with the general gameplay concept for Sonic, and Naoto Oshima, who came up with the incredible visual for the character of Sonic. I also think of designer Hirokazu Yasuhara as having a significant impact on the overall gameplay design of the game, even though he was only brought onto the project after it had begun. As the series would progress, the team would split up a bit. Yuji Naka and Hirokazu Yasuhara left for the United States, where they would work on Sonic 2. Meanwhile, Naoto Oshima would stay behind in Japan and work on Sonic CD. The two different sequels have wildly different overall ideas of how to handle Sonic, and I think really highlights the competing gameplay design philosophies on display for Sonic 1. But I'll touch more on that as we get to level design. I made a video years ago on who made Sonic the Hedgehog, which was really sparked by an interview I read in Sega Mega Drive/Genesis Collected Works with the creator of Alex Kidd, Kotaro Hayashida, where he claims, "The idea to create Sonic was also mine. It is my understanding that a lot of the ideas for Sonic were inherited from what might have been further Alex Kidd installments." It was an interesting quote that sparked me wanting to look into the full development history. He further states, "Back then, I was working as the head of the department. I let Hirokazu Yasuhara lead with the content specifications for the game, but I created the initial concept. I set the project up in order to develop a response to Mario. We had to develop a platform game with a striking appearance in order for Sega to compete against games like Mario 3. In the end, I think Kotaro Hayashida set up the now famous contest in Sega to create a competing mascot to beat Mario, and it was Yuji Naka and Naoto Oshima's project of Sonic that would win out. To my understanding though, it was actually a bit of a coincidence in terms of timing. As Naoto Oshima has stated, at the time it became known that the company was looking to adapt a mascot, we had already been independently working on the game for some time. Inspired by the idea of speeding up ghouls and ghosts, and wanting to make it so as players improve, they could beat a stage faster and faster, Yuji Naka wanted the concept of Sonic to be all about speed. So the initial concept was the playable character would be a rabbit. But as the game progressed, this evolved into a bear who could become a ball and roll. Once they decided this would make the character invincible, the character eventually evolved into a hedgehog. For more development history, you can watch my video on who made Sonic. But for this video, let's dive right into the game and talk about gameplay. Boot up Sonic the Hedgehog, and players are treated to a bright and cheery title screen, which shows off a number of elements right away. A giant Sonic animates onto the screen and starts wiggling his finger at players, showcasing right away that this is a mascot game, with an emphasis on Sonic's attitude. It seems the team wanted to showcase right away that Sonic is both cute and cool. I think a lot of the cute really comes in the animation, where we see Sonic quickly pop up and with what I can only describe as an ultra cute smile multiple times before he squints his eyes for his cool pose. I think it nicely gets across how the team probably wanted players to feel about Sonic right off the bat. Something else that this title screen nicely does though, is work as a graphical showcase for Sonic and the Sega Genesis, while also introducing movement into the title screen itself. Something Sonic does a lot of, I think in part to help sell the speed of Sonic, is use a large number of parallax scrolling layers. The background consists of a middle ground area that's the ocean and waterfall, before a background of mountains and clouds in the sky. I think a lot of games would probably opt to make this 3 parallax speeds, with the middle ground moving the fastest, and then either the mountains or the clouds all together as one unit moving the slowest, with other being an in-between speed. However, the title screen uses, well, I kinda lose track of how many speeds there are. There are 3 layers of clouds, and what looks like maybe 7 layers of that ocean middle ground, and then 3 layers of those mountains. While some games on earlier hardware, like the NES, could replicate the idea of parallax scrolling with clever programming tricks, it was incredibly difficult to do, and most games didn't do this. So this immediately helps to sell the power of the Sega Genesis. Beyond it being a clever way to show off, look how powerful our game is right off the bat, it also works a double purpose in selling the idea of Sonic being about speed. Immediately off the bat, during this title screen, the background is in motion, and thanks to this parallax scrolling, it appears to be moving at a brisk pace. So right from this first impression, players will know Sonic is cute, he has attitude, this is a game about Sonic, and we're going to be on the move. So all in all, I think this is a really successful title screen with some great music to boot. Enter into the game itself, and players will immediately enter Green Hill Zone Act 1. Before I talk about the level design and enemy design of Green Hill Zone, I think it's important to break down the various elements of the game that make Sonic feel like Sonic. I should also mention, by the way, for the sake of this video and just to make it a little easier to both record in HD and analyze, I've been playing the game on Sonic Origins. I'm playing Classic mode as it's meant to replicate the Sega Genesis, and I have Spin Dash turned off. Okay, back to game feel. The most important element to Sonic is his speed, but there are a number of ways to handle a fast character, and the Sonic team, and I'm guessing Yuji Naka in particular, decided to make Sonic's speed momentum-based. What this means is that Sonic has a drastic acceleration buildup before he reaches max speed. At the same time, he also has a pretty drastic amount of deceleration when players let go of the run button. Having an acceleration and deceleration is nothing new. In fact, this is exactly what Mario does. But Sonic's top speed is much faster than that of Mario. The counter idea to this, by the way, would be something like what the Mega Man series would end up doing from 3 and beyond, where when players run, they automatically go at the same speed no matter what, with no acceleration, and when they stop on a dime. While a game like Mega Man can give players a greater sense of control because they have so much immediate responsiveness to the character, with the speed that Sonic can end up running at, the game would probably play absolutely insane if there were no acceleration factor. Players would instantly go max speed, and ironically, in this case, feel far less control over the character. An interesting deviation in Sonic compared to Mario is that the Mario games have a dedicated run button. While I can't speak to the developer's intent here, my guess would be that this was in an attempt to give players a greater sense of control. Sonic does away with this idea, which I'd attribute to the idea that Sonic is all about speed, and really, a lot of this is already factored into his acceleration. Another potential reason for this could be the team trying to simplify the controls. Sonic actually starts off running pretty slow, to the point where if players want to play slow and steady, all they need to do is not continuously run. So I think it works out okay for Sonic, but it is interesting to consider how a run button, which would help players accelerate even faster, might have changed the overall feel of the game. Sonic will end up going max speed from a huge number of obstacles in the game, whether this be a ramp that players run down, the second half of a loop, or a spring that immediately launches Sonic into max speed. So that's where a run button might have actually been a hindrance. If players are supposed to control their speed with a button, but then these obstacles automatically launch players into Sonic's max speed, how would you handle the run button? Would players who aren't holding it automatically slow down? Would the run button then not matter at this point and only matter for acceleration? So, taking this into consideration, it could have been an issue of player confusion that led the team to decide not to include a run button. That also likely leads to the reason why Sonic has such a drastic ramp up in speed and acceleration. Without a designated run button, the team needed players to still feel some sense of control over Sonic, hence it takes a moment for him to truly start accelerating to max speed. Something else I find pretty interesting about Sonic's acceleration and deceleration are that, in some ways, this actually feels like how Ice handles in other games. I just finished my video on Mega Man 7, which is a game where players have a consistent run speed the moment they press left or right. However, when players are on Ice, they suddenly have an acceleration build up to max speed, and a deceleration slowdown from max speed. This feels odd in Mega Man because it's different from what players have grown accustomed to while playing the game and why it ends up feeling like ice. But in Sonic, because this is how the game starts, it feels natural. And if the team wants something to feel like ice, it's a matter of decreasing both the acceleration and deceleration speed, or just the deceleration speed, of what players have grown accustomed to. While this all ends up feeling good in Sonic, with players being able to accelerate to breakneck speeds, the team implemented another factor to the run that helps keep players feel in control, and this is in the way that Sonic brakes when players reverse directions. Sonic's deceleration speed is drastically increased, and Sonic will skid to a quick stop before reversing directions. With the game's use of momentum, it would definitely feel odd if players could suddenly switch directions, and this increased deceleration seems to be just the right amount to both feel good and natural at the same time. In interviews, Yuji Naka has talked about how Sonic's run was the first thing he completed, saying, "So the very first part of the program that I finished was the smooth, high-speed running action that later became the most iconic aspect of the Sonic games." I'm sure he put a lot of thought into the overall physics and how to make them feel good beyond the animations, and it really shows here. The one critique I would level at Sonic 1 is that while I understand there being no run button from the perspective of potential player confusion, it really does feel like there needs to be some sort of way to pick up momentum quicker, as the run really does take longer than what I'd consider ideal for picking up speed. Later Sonic games introduced the Spin Dash, which is an instant speed boost players can get, and while that feels like the perfect solution, it's sorely missing here in Sonic 1. Another key component of what makes Sonic feel like Sonic is in his jump. There are many ways to handle a jump in a platform game that help to give these games their unique feels. Teams can make it so a jump always takes players to the exact same height no matter what, which helps to simplify overall platforming. This is especially good for games where platforming isn't a key feature to the game, or if it is, the team expects a much wider audience. Controlling your jump by holding down the jump button for a higher jump is actually a little more advanced, and can trip up new players, making these games immediately less friendly. And while advanced players like myself might appreciate a deeper level of control, really, it isn't always necessary. Another way to handle a jump is in the way some key Nintendo games handle it. Both Mario and Donkey Kong in Donkey Kong Country have 3 jump heights to their early games: a short jump, a middle jump, and a high jump. The difference between these 3 heights in both of these aren't very drastic, and players get a lot of leeway to perform the high jump in that they don't need to really fully hold down the jump button the entire time. After a certain amount of time, the game takes over and it assumes the player wanted to perform a high jump. From my own testing in the game I'm working on, I found that the reason these games do this is because that probably usually is the case. Even in a game like Mario, where players will be constantly platforming as the entire point of the game, I think it's pretty rare for players not to want a full jump. Then there are games like the Mega Man series. By Mega Man 3 and onwards, players are given full control of their jump. The moment they let go of the jump button, they'll start decelerating for their fall. This makes sense in a game like Mega Man, as because players are constantly dealing with projectiles they need to avoid, players really do need that full sense of control in order to properly avoid all of these obstacles. Another thing to consider is jump power and gravity. How much jump power do you give the character, as in, once you press the jump button, how quickly do they move vertically? Then, at what point does the game take control for the player and give players the full jump? From there, how much gravity weighs in on the character once they reach their full height, and how quickly do they drop? Sonic has a pretty significant amount of jump power to his jump, so much so that in testing, I was surprised to find players can control his jump height. It's just difficult to nail the exact height with him, as holding down the jump button so quickly boosts his height. I haven't played Sonic since Sonic Origins first came out, so I hadn't thought too deeply about his jump before, and honestly was kind of expecting it to behave similar to Mario and there being 3 distinct jump heights. However, like in Mega Man, players have full control over Sonic's jump height. However, what differentiates Sonic is the jump power and when the game chooses to take control. Trying to quickly tap Sonic for a jump, he will immediately shoot up to a decent height, meaning players can't really bunny hop like they can in a game like Mega Man. At the same time, because his jump power is so strong, it becomes difficult to stop exactly when you might want to. Here, I'm trying to use the palm tree's ridges to measure my jump height and slowly progress jumping up one notch at a time, and found that while I was in control, it was a little more challenging to truly do this than in a game like Mega Man. Another thing to note about this aspect of the jump is that players have some of that max jump leeway I talked about before. It feels, to me at least, in Sonic 1, that if a player lets go of the jump button when they're relatively close to the max height, even if they haven't reached it, the game will decide to still give Sonic a full jump. Now this could honestly be more of a feeling because his jump power is so strong, but what all of this results in is a game that still manages to be friendly to newer players who might struggle with the idea of holding the jump button will make Sonic jump higher. His jump power is so quick and large, players will pretty quickly launch to Sonic's peak jump height, intentional or not. One more aspect that's interesting about Sonic's jump is how X momentum is handled in the air. Once again, this is something where there are a plethora of ways to design around this. A game like Castlevania tries to be more realistic in its jump. Once a player jumps in one direction, they're stuck going in that direction no matter what. A game like Mega Man is the polar opposite. Players will switch directions at full speed in the air, no matter what. A game like Ninja Gaiden is a bit of an in-between. Players are somewhat stuck in the direction they're moving, but if they press a button to reverse directions midair, they'll slow down and eventually reverse directions at a much reduced speed. Sonic seems to handle its horizontal X momentum in the air similar to how momentum is handled on the ground. Sonic will rapidly slow down, and once reaching a stopped position, reverse directions. In fact, it's so similar, I have a feeling it's using the same code as momentum on the ground, which also probably contributes to why the game feels good to play. Yes, changing how Sonic controls in the air is a choice the team could have made, but as his momentum acts similar in the air to on the ground, it adds a level of consistency players can expect, and is part of what makes platforming in Sonic feel good. Players will always understand exactly how Sonic will act, on the ground or not. Another key element to Sonic's movement is in his spin. While the spin dash wouldn't be introduced until Sonic 2, in Sonic 1, players can spin if either they jump, in which case Sonic's jump is a spin, explaining why he can defeat enemies by jumping on them, or if players are running, by pressing down, Sonic will begin rolling along the ground. Rolling functions a little different from running in a number of key ways. For one, and the most obvious, is that it acts as an attack. If players hit an enemy from the side while they're spinning, they'll destroy that enemy unless there's some sort of obstacle the enemy has to prevent this. As that's the case, there are a number of enemies in Sonic whose backs are either impervious to damage or far more dangerous to hit, making rolling the ideal way to defeat these enemies. So a great job by the team designing enemies specifically based around Sonic's moveset. Another obvious element to spinning is that Sonic will become smaller, meaning he can fit into smaller spaces or avoid certain enemy attacks. Fitting into smaller spaces comes particularly in handy as the team specifically seemed to design obstacles around this idea, with many of them crushing Sonic if the player is caught inside. So the spin will give players a little bit more wiggle room to make it out of these spaces without being crushed. Finally, one that I actually didn't know until looking this up on Sonic's Retro Wiki, which is a great resource for finding out how the classic Sonic games are programmed, and in particular, has a fantastic guide to the physics of Sonic. The roll actually has less friction applied to it than running. So, what that means is that players will decelerate slower if they're rolling than if they're running, helping to keep up their momentum. Rolling then acts as both an offensive tool and a fun tool for keeping up momentum, really complementing the overall gameplay conceit of speed. Even Sonic's main attacks of rolling and bouncing keep players moving, as opposed to some sort of melee attack that would stop the player completely, or a projectile, which, sure, players could use while running, but it doesn't enhance the concept of speed quite as well as bouncing and rolling do. And speaking of that spin jump, it also holds an important distinction from that of Mario's jump, in that it's an attack from all angles. If players hit enemies from the side or below while they're spinning, whether in the air or rolling on the ground, it counts as an attack. While precision jumping on enemies can help the player, as Sonic will bounce off, that also means that players will fly right through the enemies when spinning in the air and not bouncing on them, once again acting as a tool to maintain Sonic's momentum. On the topic of bouncing, it's a key detail to Sonic that he has a bounce when jumping on enemies. This is nothing new. I mean, Mario's been bouncing off of enemies since Mario 1, but that doesn't stop this from being a positive element to Sonic's moveset. The team could have chosen to make Sonic not bounce when on top of enemies and fly right through them, just like hitting them from the side. And while this would have worked fine, it not only would have resulted in the team needing to design their bosses completely different, but I also do think bouncing is the more fun choice. The act of bouncing in video games is fun, but why is it fun? I think there are a number of key factors at play here. For one, I think there's an element at play where it feels natural. Think of a bouncy ball, especially in the case of Sonic when he's in a ball and spinning. It feels like what should happen. It's also a skill thing. If you land on an enemy and bounce off, it immediately feels like you accomplished something because you hit the target and there's a very large immediate reaction to it. Next, a bounce typically is combined with a satisfying sound effect to give it a bit of punch. And finally, bouncing can be utilized for a number of fun gameplay elements. This could be bouncing off of multiple enemies in a row, creating a satisfying sense of accomplishment as you take out enemies while playing The Floor is Lava, or it can also serve as a method for platforming. Bouncing is such a fun mechanic, I think it was the key to Mario's success. I also might be a bit biased, because bouncing is also a key mechanic to the game I'm working on, where we took inspiration from the way diving and bouncing worked in Castlevania Symphony of the Night and further elaborated on that idea. There are several ways to handle a bounce. For example, in our game, as we use a dive mechanic, we decide to have a general bounce height per enemy, but then have certain enemies that might super bounce the player, or objects that spring them up, bounce them back, etc., etc. Sonic's way to handle the bounce is, again, as per the conceit of the game, momentum-based. Sonic's Y speed will be multiplied by -1, sending him flying into the air at the exact same speed he was coming down. And in the case of Sonic, this is another reason why it works as such a fun and clever mechanic that really complements the overall idea of momentum in the game. You're reversing your direction like a pinball on a bumper, but you still maintain momentum, which is the key ingredient here. While I think it's likely Sonic's bounce was added due to fun factor more than anything else, it did affect the way all of the enemies and bosses in the game had to be handled. While Sonic does destroy enemies in one hit, some of them have bouncy armor or spikes. If Sonic couldn't bounce, it would come down to enemies could no longer have shields. They would all hurt Sonic instead, like the spiked enemies who do exist. As Sonic is right now, players bounce off of Robotnik, both in an X and Y direction. But if Sonic didn't have a bounce, how would these boss fights work? Would Sonic just fly through Robotnik, hurting him then landing on the ground? Would bosses all be designed so players need to spin and roll into them? Would Robotnik bounce back when Sonic jumps on or into him? I'm honestly not sure how much enemy and boss design factored into the decision for Sonic to bounce versus giving him a pinball sort of feeling, and the fun that comes from that, but I do think this decision works really well for Sonic in particular. Another element I want to touch on for Sonic's moveset is ducking. While ducking is a mechanic that was incorporated into Mario from the start, it's not necessarily a common platform game ability. So what are the pros and cons to this choice? There's quotes from Akira Kitamura in designing Mega Man, where he was very specifically against the duck mechanic in Mega Man, even though they had thought about it, because it would have upped the complexity of the game in a way they didn't want. And I think that added complexity really is the bulk of it. If all you can do is jump, your options for dealing with an enemy attack are pretty simple. If you can duck, even as minor as it is, the game has now become slightly more complex. Whether the team initially wanted Sonic to duck or not, I'm not sure, but with Sonic rolling into a ball, it probably became a pretty weird if Sonic couldn't duck. Players become smaller when they're rolling, at least from a hitbox perspective, and players have to press down anyways to do this. So in the case of Sonic, ducking not only works as a mechanic for avoiding enemy attacks, but also becomes a visual feedback to the player for rolling. Yes, Sonic 1 hadn't incorporated the spin dash yet, but for a brand new player, it definitely invokes the idea of, oh, if I press down, that does something. And intentional or not, if they end up pressing down to avoid an enemy attack while they're in motion, they'll suddenly start spinning and learn how to perform Sonic's spin roll without ever needing somebody to explain the controls. Because Sonic 1 does have a duck mechanic, it's actually nice that there are various situations the team creates in tight spaces where ducking is the correct solution for not getting hurt, so the team definitely did consider this part of Sonic's moveset in their level and enemy design. With Sonic's moveset out of the way, I want to talk about another key feature to Sonic that really becomes the shining star of the game, and a big reason I think it would become so popular, and that's ramps. There are slopes which slow Sonic down as he runs up, and downward slopes which of course speed Sonic up. Adding angles immediately ups the complexity of a game from a programming standpoint, because now you have to consider this with hitboxes and with character placement on a ramp. If you notice, visually, Sonic isn't always actually touching the ground. Some of the stages have shading to the ground, with Sonic standing somewhere within the shading, or grass, where Sonic is somewhere near the top, which helps to hide this. But if you really look when Sonic is running on sloped surfaces, his feet aren't touching when they should be, which can be especially noticeable when the tileset doesn't work to hide this with shading. This is even true on some parts of stages where Sonic is standing on a flat surface, but visually, he's a few pixels off. It's not an issue, by the way, but I think it's one of those things that probably has to do with the way the game was coded in order to account for all of the ramps and sloped surfaces. In fact, I actually really admire the team doing this, because it seems like a difficult problem to solve. And because these ramps all serve to speed up or slow down Sonic, it really helps add to the feeling of these levels being roller coasters Sonic is on, even incorporating vertical traversal and loop-de-loops. From a gameplay standpoint, the ramps also add a huge amount of complexity. Not only are the angles factored into Sonic's acceleration and deceleration, but also in his jump. So players can actually use angled jumps to reach places they otherwise wouldn't be able to, which is an interesting little advanced skill set tool. Ramps can also lead to Sonic running up a wall or around a loop, which is another factor that makes Sonic really stand out from any of its competitors. The loops are a nice visual touch, which really don't add too much in the sense of actual gameplay, which is probably why we don't see it too much outside of Green Hill Zone, but add a lot of wow factor for players. I don't think every aspect of a game necessarily has to serve a purpose towards an end goal. If it feels fun to do and fits within the gameplay, that's more than enough justification, in my opinion. The ramps which let Sonic run vertically, on the other hand, are an incredibly interesting tool. While Sonic can platform by jumping up and around, this becomes one of the ways Sonic can traverse vertically. It fits right within his moveset, as going up a ramp and launching off requires momentum and speed, and then continues movement for the player. It becomes Sonic's unique way of vertical climbing. So, another really brilliant feature that sets him apart. Another thing I want to say impresses me is how the team handled Sonic's vertical and upside down traversal. In the way many games are handled, characters have different states they can be in. You might be in an idle state, a jumping state, a rolling state, etc., etc. But Sonic does something unique in accounting for the various angles by having different running states based on the angle of the wall and Sonic's motion. For the visuals here, I'm using sonicretro.org because they really do a fantastic job of showcasing this. As Sonic runs up a slope, once he reaches a 46-degree angle, he'll switch to a right wall mode, where his collision data is flipped. At this angle, walls will act like floors, and Sonic's colliders, which, if this is accurate, look like little raycasts coming out from each side of him to detect the floor, will flip in order to find floors at this new angle. Continuing along, if Sonic reaches a 135-degree angle, he'll switch to his ceiling mode, where everything flips, and now the ceiling acts as ground to run along. Then, at 225 degrees, Sonic will enter a left wall mode. All of these angles are mirrored when Sonic is going the opposite direction, and Sonic also looks for angles in order to run down a wall, which will also enter him into a wall mode. Another interesting element to this is that when Sonic jumps, the game will give him ceiling raycast sensors. This is notable for a number of reasons. The first and most obvious reason is that it's what allows Sonic to bump the ceiling, and the game to detect he's bumped the ceiling and therefore start falling down. This sort of raycast check is something that I'm using for my own game for ceiling detection, because before we had this, players would continue to float in the air against the ceiling while holding the jump button, which definitely doesn't feel right. It could certainly have its place if you have a character who's flying, but the bump feels more natural. The other reason, in the case of Sonic, is that this will also detect certain angles, and if it finds the correct angle, that's what allows Sonic to start running along a ramp in the air. I feel like I'm just gushing in this section, but I truly am impressed with just how clever the programming and gameplay design is with these ramps, and how it all came together to truly make the Sonic games memorable and unique. Something I briefly touched on was that the player has different states they go into. States are a really clever way to program or think about the player or enemies, because when a character is in a certain state, it will always behave the exact same way or exit that state the exact same way. While I touched on active states players can press buttons to do, Another fun aspect to Sonic is how his idle state performs. Typically, up to this point, when a player entered an idle state, the character would either stand there motionless, doing nothing, or sort of idly blink. When players aren't moving Sonic, after a short period of time, Sonic will enter a new animation where he visibly looks at the player annoyed and impatient. It's a far more animated expression than players would typically see at this point, really giving Sonic a lot more character, making even standing still feel more fun, and add to the sense of speed in the game. The final state Sonic can go into that I haven't mentioned, well, outside of getting hit or dying, is that when players are too close to a platform's edge, Sonic will switch to an animation where it looks like he's attempting not to fall off the side. This is one of those nice touches that wasn't really necessary, but it does serve both the purpose of making Sonic feel more alive, while also giving players feedback that they're close enough to the ledge that they're about to fall off, without a guessing game of exactly where Sonic's ground colliders start and end. Another important element to any game is how the camera functions. I'm going to use my game a little bit to show this because it's easy to visually show it this way. In a 2D game, which simplifies things quite a bit, there are only a few ways to handle a camera. In an action platform game, like Sonic, the camera will follow along with the character, but the question becomes, how? And what feels good? Within a modern 2D camera, you'll typically have a few different zones, so to speak. There's a zone where the camera might not move at all, a zone where the camera will slowly or quickly move to follow along with the player, and then a zone where the camera will pretty much immediately follow along with the player. The speed of all of these are dependent on the programmer's and designer's decision, and will really affect the feel of the game. You might want a camera to slowly catch up with players when they start moving horizontally to really separate the character from the background. Or you might make a jump slowly catch up to a player, but then a fall immediately catch up to the player to give a little weight to the jump, but also still ensure players are always seeing all of the action in the game. You might make it so the camera always keeps the player in the center of the screen, no matter what. This might help with a fast-paced action game where you want to ensure the player is always seeing what they need to see. Then, there's a game like Donkey Kong Country that pretty drastically swings the camera in whichever direction the player is moving. That helps for Donkey Kong Country, as the sprites are so large, it ensures players are seeing the action in the direction they're moving. Ultimately, it's all going to come down to the feel the designers want the game to have, and how they want players to see the action of the game. Coming back around to Sonic, Sonic actually incorporates those no camera movement zones I talked about. There's a very slight horizontal dead zone, and then a much larger dead zone vertically, that only takes effect when Sonic is jumping. So, if Sonic is running across the ground, the camera will always track and keep Sonic in the same Y position on the screen. But if you notice, because there's a box around Sonic horizontally, and the camera only tracks Sonic on the edge of these boxes, it means that when players are running, Sonic is never truly at the center of the screen. As I mentioned before, it's one of those tools that can help make Sonic feel a little more separate from the background, and perhaps it also adds to his sense of speed. When he first starts moving, the camera doesn't follow him, but then once it does, it immediately makes it feel like he's started to pick up speed and run faster. The large, wide dead zones on his jump and fall are interesting to me, as it actually limits players from seeing where they're going when they jump up, or maybe more importantly, when they're falling. It speaks to the team perhaps thinking the action in the middle of the screen was still the most important, regardless of which direction Sonic is traveling. It also makes it so that when Sonic jumps, the camera never ends up going too high, so players can still see what's going to be below them. Another interesting thing about this is that the camera won't ever lock Sonic into its X position, but after jumping or falling, the camera will slowly come back and lock Sonic into its Y position. I do wonder if perhaps the bottom portion of the Y dead zone should have been removed, as there are definitely situations where it would have been nice to see where Sonic is going to fall and have more time to react. One more aspect of the camera that's worth touching on is how far away is the camera from the action. In modern games, like the one I'm working on, this is a simple thing to adjust, because you literally move back and forwards the camera. But back during the Sega Genesis days, while I don't know this for certain, I imagine it was likely more a case of creating sprites at a certain size, and you were locked into that size without being able to simply zoom in or out a camera. The positive of moving the camera closer to the character is it will typically make everything look a little nicer as you can really see the details on the character, but then zooming the camera out will help players see the action more on an action game. So it really comes down to a balancing act of what sprite size for the character looks and feels good, but still allows for all of the action to be seen in the game. With Sonic moving as fast as he does at different points, I do think sometimes it would have been nice for the camera to be zoomed out a little bit more, as that can cause problems in knowing and predicting where Sonic will end up. At full speed, unless players have the map memorized, it really starts to feel like luck as to what you'll run into or hit. And while some people might find that to be fun about Sonic, while I do like his speed, I think any way to show more of the action might have been a positive thing. Something that is an option, by the way, but probably not possible during the Sega Genesis days, is zooming out the camera as Sonic picks up speed, then zooming back in the camera once Sonic slows down. It might have been too much movement or maybe make people dizzy, but in modern games that is an option. Another option is what I mentioned Donkey Kong Country did, where the camera whips in the direction the player is facing, showing more in front of the player but less behind them. That's something Sonic might have benefited from in allowing players to see more of where they're going, although it's hard to tell for sure how it would have felt, positive or negative, unless I were to actually experiment and test it. Speaking on the camera, Sonic also allows players to look both up and down. Sonic has a unique animation for looking up, which is of course a nice touch, and if players hold up or down long enough, the camera will move in that direction to reveal what's above or below. While it's pretty rare I personally use this feature, it is a nice touch for players who want to be a little more cautious in where they're going, and overall, there's no negative to including this feature. We've talked a lot about Sonic and how he controls, but before moving on to Green Hill Zone, I want to talk about an important gimmick we're going to see throughout the entire game, and that is an important facet to Sonic's movement, and that's in the various springs found throughout the game. If Sonic touches a spring, it will immediately launch Sonic whichever direction it's facing, with the speed dependent on the color of the spring. Red springs have more power than yellow springs. In Sonic 1, these springs will only face vertical or horizontal, although Sonic 2 would introduce diagonal springs. Because Sonic can't spin dash in Sonic 1, this becomes the perfect tool for immediately giving Sonic a huge speed boost. It also aids in vertical traversal, becoming a far more fun way to quickly traverse vertically rather than something like climbing up a ladder, and as another tool for vertical traversal rather than slowly jumping from platform to platform on a pure vertical climb. Springs are also frequently used as obstacles where players might run into a spring propelling them in the wrong direction. I can't emphasize enough how clever I find these springs and how well they work in Sonic. They add to the conceit of the game being about speed, add unique and interesting ways to platform, and even work as obstacles. Alright, I'm going to talk a little bit more on Sonic mechanics later, but let's take a break and talk about the first stage of the game, Green Hill Zone. Green Hill Zone has become an absolutely iconic stage, thanks in part to both its music and art design. From a game design perspective, Green Hill Zone really acts as a way to introduce the mechanics of Sonic without ever being too difficult. A first stage of any game is all about introducing players to the mechanics of the game and teaching them how to play. So for Sonic, at the very start, the first thing players see is the ground is curved, immediately introducing the idea of acceleration and speed, which is the most important idea to Sonic. So it was really clever to make sure the ground wasn't flat at the start here, but shows off all of the angles we're about to see. Next, a few golden, shiny rings not on the ground, but in the air. I wonder if you can get those. Oh, press any button on the controller and Sonic will jump, and you'll get those gold shiny things. The UI says rings, and I can see how many I have, so they must be important. They also look shiny and enticing to get, so players will likely want them. Next, we see a platform players can jump onto with a computer monitor with a ring on it. Notably, the monitor isn't in the center of this platform, but on the left edge. This was probably purposely placed here, because as players jump onto the ledge, it's pretty likely they'll end up jumping not onto the ring monitor, but into the ring monitor. This destroys the monitor and gives Sonic 10 rings. This is incredibly important for teaching players, because while many players of the time were likely used to Mario, where jumping onto enemies destroyed them, but into enemies would hurt Mario, Sonic has jumped into something and it destroyed it. And it's not an enemy, so it acts as a safe way to teach this. After getting rings, which acts as health, and understanding at least one way Sonic can attack and jumping, players will run into their first batch of enemies. None of these enemies are particularly complex or difficult, which will be a recurring element to Sonic, but they do act as the first real obstacles. Something fun to note here is that right off the bat, Sonic meets 4 of the 5 enemies that will be present throughout the entirety of the Green Hill Zone, so the game actually works pretty fast in introducing new obstacles. Something else the game does here is that the first enemy is an easy grounded enemy who appears right next to the first platform. So, if players jump to kill it, they'll likely end up landing on the platform, learning Sonic can not only land on ground, but jump through certain ground to land on it. This is pretty important because not every game allows players to jump through platforms from the bottom. On top of that, it really encourages players to roll in order to kill the first enemy, which they might not know is possible yet if it's their first time playing, so either way, they should be learning something here. Then, the second enemy is an enemy in the air, requiring Sonic to jump. But notably, this second enemy of the Buzz Bomber is introduced on our first major slope. That means that if players jump to destroy the Buzz Bomber, they should immediately notice that Sonic won't jump straight up on an angled surface, like Mario does, but jumps at an angle adjusted for the slope. Again, another great teaching tool right at the start. There's also another one for more observant players. If players have jumped onto the first platform and then jump off to make progress, they might notice that there's rings just on the edge, so how do you get to those? If players slow down, they might accidentally hit a hidden spring in the palm tree and be bounced up to collect those rings. So there's a lot going on here to teach players, and very quick. After the third enemy of the chopper fish, players can find yet another hidden element in the trees, this one much more apparent, and this one being an invincibility box. Even if players don't find these hidden tree secrets though, it adds a nice bit of replayability to the game, with hidden elements to find, which I think is something that was important to Yuji Naka, as he specifically talked about wanting to make a game where players could complete stages faster and faster as they replay them. Eventually, players will make it to the first major split path. This one is interesting for a number of reasons. Zooming the game out by looking at its sprite sheet and using sprites-resource.com for this, you can see that there are 2 paths here. One below players won't be able to see, and one above which appears to be, for new players, the only path. If players jump onto the edge, a new obstacle is introduced as the ground will crumble beneath them, and if they don't jump in time, they'll hurtle to their doom, or actually, a safe alternate route. If clever players look down here, they might notice the tops of palm trees, which might indicate that there's ground below, although interestingly, they'll never actually see the ground. I watched a video by Zoomzyke, whose content was introduced to me recently, analyzing Sonic, and he complained about this being poor design, because at this point, players won't know that there are alternate routes in the game, and he thinks that was a bad choice, and a visible alternate route should have been shown first. I disagree. Although, look, I think he makes great content. This is a totally subjective point here. I don't think there's anything wrong with players not knowing there are alternate routes in Sonic games yet, and not knowing this will be an alternate route. In fact, I think it's the more interesting choice. Players are encouraged here to go on the upper path. If they overjump and mess up, they're going to safely discover there's a second path here. If they land on the crumbling ground and fall, they'll safely discover there's a second path. In fact, the upper path has a second section immediately of even more crumbling ground where, again, players might accidentally safely discover the alternate path. Finally, the paths will converge before the game's first loop, and players should notice at this point there was an alternate path below them the entire time, even if they never ended up taking it. There's no reason players need to know about this alternate path. In fact, it ends up being designed as more of a secret. If players do go down to the bottom, they'll find multiple ring boxes and an invincibility box. So, if anything, I think this acts as a tool to teach players that the route that seems like the obvious and correct route to take isn't always going to be. There will be branching paths, and you actually don't know which one is the best one. At the end of the day, your only real goal is to make it to the end of the level, and yes, eventually do so with 50 rings. But really, missing this bottom path doesn't matter. It doesn't hurt the player in any way. So I don't think this is an issue, as the game will later introduce more obvious alternate paths, giving players a chance to ponder what alternate paths they might have missed previously. To my mind, the real issue, and this is going to be a frequent issue in Sonic, is that because there are frequently alternate paths below a drop like this which players won't be able to see, it means that there will be a lot of times players are going to be guessing, is this drop going to lead to my death, or is it going to be an alternate path? While sometimes the games, plural, do a good job of communicating or accounting for this, like having a trap area underneath instead of instant death, other times they don't. So that really is a dilemma that you run into by making this choice in general. Back to Green Hill Zone, regardless of which route players take, they'll be funneled into the big wow moment of the loop. Even though, as I said, this doesn't matter too much in terms of actual gameplay, you're essentially watching Sonic do something, it still feels cool and I think warrants its inclusion. I suppose you could argue it forces players to run at a certain speed, so it's like a speed check, but I don't think that ends up making much of a difference here. The level then splits into 3 paths, with the bottom 2 introducing these really cool speed boost spinning sections, which, like the loop, are a wow factor thing. But it also should serve the dual purpose of forcing new players to learn how to roll. If players have been taking the main path the entire time, what's nice about this is that the bottom path, which I'd argue is the main path, will speed players up and force them to launch off of a ramp, showing them not 1, not 2, but all 3 routes in the process of the launch. So if you haven't figured it out yet, there are multiple routes, and the game is now forcing you to see this in a pretty cool way. Nothing about Act 1 is particularly difficult, with the simple enemies serving as the main obstacles here. There's no insta-death pits, and really, I think it serves as the perfect introduction to the mechanics of Sonic 1, with a fantastic opening sequence and an introduction to springs and alternate routes throughout. There's a reason Green Hill Zone is so beloved and fondly remembered. I don't intend to break down every act in this much detail, by the way, but it felt fitting for the introduction to the game. Green Hill Zone Act 2 has one of my favorite secrets in Sonic 1. Players can jump over the first set of spikes they find for a cool hidden area with a bunch of goodies. It also introduces these breakable walls, which visibly look different than the rest. Players will be stuck here otherwise, so it's a nice way to force players to experiment around with their moveset. It's also probably smart this is in Act 2, as if players do get stuck here, they hopefully would have already been having enough fun with the game to not frustratedly turn it off and never play again. What's actually clever is that there are spikes on one end, meaning for players who do get stuck, instead of turning off the game, they do have the option to kill themselves and restart at the beginning of the stage. Yes, they didn't learn the roll wall breaking mechanic, but it's never necessary in the game, so that's probably okay and better to avoid total frustration. While they're a bit of a gimmick, I love these breakable walls as there's such a cool visceral response to rolling into them, and I honestly wish they were used a little bit more. Although, I suppose the counter to that is it forces players to stop if they run into one, and this is a game about movement and speed. There is a funny moment in Green Hill Zone Act 2 where a great design choice seems to be combined with a kinda controversial design choice. After the stages require loop, there's a ramp that will force players into a hidden invincibility box. This is fantastic, as players will most likely end up hitting this completely by accident, reveal the secret, and make them wonder just how many secrets have been in the trees all along they either missed or will want to look for. But being invincible will likely make players want to run and move faster, and right after this is a sequence where players should be playing cautiously and slow. If they don't, they'll likely accidentally run into a death pit and die. So here's the question, is this a good design choice, or is it a bad design choice? Let's talk about the negative first. As I said, players have just become invincible. They want to go fast, but it will certainly lead to their doom, and that's no good, as Sonic would say. But, and hear me out, it's not all bad. As we're going to talk about with Marble Zone, the game is going to quickly become about more obstacles and being more cautious. So, this is the first true point where players are going to learn the hard way that going fast isn't always the best choice. And while yes, this has been shown before with bumpers and enemies, this really is the most major example of it so far, which is accentuated by it happening just as players have gotten invincibility. I obviously can't dive into the developers' brains here and know exactly what their intent was, but I have to imagine that this was specifically meant to be a learning moment and was likely intentionally designed as such. To be fair, as a kid, I never particularly liked this spot because I hated needing to slow down for it and would sometimes forget, but I don't think it's automatically bad for it. Looking at it now, while I'm not sure if I like this choice per se, I actually find it to be an interesting choice, and certainly more of a difficulty ramp up than we'd seen so far in Green Hill Zone. But I'll leave it to you watching to tell me how you feel about it, and if you like or dislike the choice. Overall, and somewhat ironically, Green Hill Zone is one of the few stages in Sonic 1 that's truly designed for players to go fast. There are several alternate routes in Green Hill Zone, with some being about speed and some about platforming, which really plays into that idea Yuji Naka spoke on about making it so as players replay the levels, they'd be able to complete stages faster and faster, as it really makes it so players can find the best routes that work for them and complete each stage in their own way, really adding a huge amount of replayability to these stages. All of these stages have that roller coaster vibe that I think Yuji Naka originally envisioned, with a lot of ramps, loops, and in general, terrain with a lot of different angles. It immediately shows off what makes Sonic unique and acts as the perfect introduction to the game and, eventually, series, with a light sprinkling of obstacles to keep things interesting. Bringing this back to overall mechanics, a major element I skipped over to Sonic's design is in rings. Like in Mario, where Mario collects coins, Sonic collects rings. However, what sets rings apart and really makes them stand out is that they don't just provide players with a 1-up if players collect 100, if players collect 50, they can enter bonus stages in Sonic 1 at the end of an act, and even more important, rings act as the player's health, creating a unique way to handle health in a platform game. There are many obstacles in Sonic 1 that will slow down Sonic and stop Sonic in his tracks, so it probably created a pretty unique design challenge for the Sonic team. In most platform games, players have a set amount of health, and sometimes they can collect some sort of item to regain health. But with Sonic, because the team probably wanted players to be able to go at max speed and play a little less cautiously, the standard limited health would really be a pretty big hurdle for most players. Think about it. If you had, say, 5 health in a stage, with only limited places to find health, you'd probably automatically play a little more reserved, knowing that going too fast could very quickly put you in a position to get hit and lose health, especially with the speed Sonic runs at. And with that, because it's so difficult for players to predict and react in time to obstacles when they're hurtling at max speed, it could run the risk of quickly making the game feel unfair. So, Sonic has a pretty brilliant idea that I, personally, hadn't seen before. To be fair, I don't know the full NES, arcade, or Sega roster of games prior to Sonic, but no matter where it came from, the idea of rings works incredibly well for Sonic. Rings act as Sonic's health, and even a single ring will protect Sonic from dying. So in that way, there is health littered throughout the entire stage. But with this lies the potential issue of players quickly amassing too much health and trivializing any challenge. So the team came up with yet another brilliant feature to Sonic in how his get hit state works. When players are hit by enemies, like a typical platform game, Sonic enters a get hit animation, is knocked back, and has a momentary invincibility frame so players have an opportunity to get out of their predicament without instantly dying anyways. But what's unique is that Sonic also loses all of his rings. So while rings are frequent and easy to find, get hit and you're losing your health/shield and currency towards both a 1-up and a hidden bonus stage. So it acts as a great way to balance out the frequency of finding rings. Yes, you find rings easily in the stage, and it will serve as protective health, but get hit, and you lose them all. Finally though, the team came up with yet another cool feature to this, where Sonic won't just lose his rings, but they'll spray out of him in all directions, with players given a temporary chance to recollect them, meaning that it's actually fairly easy to immediately get back that health buffer. So all in all, these rings end up acting as a way to make it so players who want to play uncautiously and speed around can do so, while only having a minor setback for getting hit. Even then, Having more rings is still better because more rings will spray out of Sonic when getting hit, making it easier to recollect some of them as health. But then, players who want 1-ups, or perhaps more importantly, those bonus stages, will need to play a little more cautious because that's the true thing you're losing out on by getting hit. Altogether, this creates a totally unique but balanced currency and health risk and reward system at the same time. The way rings work helps Sonic from becoming overly difficult while still rewarding players for playing well. Like the way ramps work in Sonic, this is, to my opinion, another one of those key magic ingredients that really made Sonic the incredible success that it was from a gameplay standpoint. Speaking on getting hit and iframes, the main obstacle I missed talking about for Green Hill Zone, as it deserves its own section, is spikes. While some games, like Mega Man, use spikes to instantly kill players, Sonic uses spikes similar to enemies and them acting as obstacles Sonic can't touch the pointy end of, else he'll be hurt if he has rings, or, of course, like any other obstacle in the game, die with no rings. It's a nice way for Green Hill Zone, as the opening act to the game, to introduce difficulty, but with lower stakes than insta-death pits. I also think insta-death pits in Sonic, in particular, are a little bit tricky to pull off fairly due to the multiple routes and the fact players oftentimes won't know if they'll be dropping to safety or death if there's too many insta-death pits. It is interesting that the team chose to make it so spikes would only hurt Sonic if he touches the pointy end. I say that because that definitely isn't always the case, as several games have a collider around the entire spike that will hurt the player no matter what. It's a little more complex to do, as a portion of the spike will act like ground, especially the horizontal spike Sonic can jump on top of. This choice definitely makes a lot of sense for Sonic in particular, as Sonic is running so fast, it means that Sonic can run into vertical spikes, but the team still has an obstacle players will need to properly platform over, providing something a little more unique that remains fair considering Sonic's speed. Spikes in Sonic 1 are a little peculiar though, in that if Sonic has iframes after getting hit, a spike will still kill Sonic regardless of iframes. Sonic 2 and onwards changed this up, so iframes work normally on spikes, and Sonic Origins even automatically sets Sonic 1's spike coding off as an optional thing players will have to choose to turn on. Because I haven't seen the code behind Sonic 1, it's hard for me to determine if this was intentional or a bug, and I have seen it referred to as a bug. Either way, Sonic 1 would end up with this iframe spike issue, so let's take a look at the end result. What this ends up meaning is that while spikes don't instantly kill Sonic, there are both situations where Sonic will bounce back from his get hit animation to safety, or Sonic will bounce back onto another set of spikes and instantly die, making the spikes act a bit more akin to an insta-death pit. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. As I've mentioned a couple times, death pits can be difficult in Sonic to pull off well due to both the multiple paths of the game as well as the way the camera works. So spikes acting as somewhat of an insta-death here create a very clear visual way to create a similar trap, but one that works better in the case of Sonic. I will say that I prefer the way spikes handle in Sonic 2 and beyond. I like the distinction between there being traps that instantly kill players, like insta-death pits, and traps where iframes give players a little more leeway to make it out of a dire situation. There's one more mechanic to Sonic that will always linger in the background, but helps add to the idea of movement, and that's in the ever-present time limit. Time limits have been a thing dating all the way back to Super Mario Bros. On the NES. It's a notable feature to me in Mario, because I'm not sure if I think it's all that necessary in the Mario games. It keeps players from lingering too long and subtly says, hey, don't worry too much about exploration, just make it to your goal. But is that really a boon to Mario? I suppose you could argue that there's fun in the idea of feeling rushed when time is almost out, and you're sweating trying to cross the finish line in time with an added intensity, but if that fits Mario or not is really another discussion. Something interesting about Mario is that the game would also release to arcade, where a time limit makes a whole lot of sense, as you wouldn't want players to hog an arcade cabinet for too long, with moving along players and getting more quarters being part of the point of arcade game design. But Super Mario Bros. Was originally released for both the Famicom and NES before an arcade version would ever be released, so I'm not sure how much, if at all, that idea was factored into the original gameplay design. Anyways, all of that leads us to Sonic. Now, not every game uses a time limit. The Mega Man games, which by now you know I love to reference, partially because I've been working on a very long design retrospective series of those games and know them incredibly well at this point, don't have a time limit. But Sonic chooses to add one, which in the case of Sonic, I think does make sense. Stand and do nothing, and as we talked about, Sonic's idle stance will have him tapping his feet, annoyed and waiting for the player to keep playing. Everything is designed around the idea of keeping players moving, and on top of that, with Yuji Naka wanting players to be able to complete stages faster and faster, they'd be able to quickly glance at the clock to see how quickly they are completing a stage. In fact, a notable difference in the timer between Sonic and Mario is that while Mario's timer counts down, Sonic's timer counts up, which really adds to that idea of an early, internally built speedrun system, with players being subtly encouraged to work on their completion times. In the end, as far as the speedrun concept is concerned, I think Sonic would have really needed a leaderboard to sell that aspect, for me, but it still does feel like a subtle nod towards that. With all of the routes and Sonic stages, it also stops players from being able to spend too much time exploring, which has its pros and cons. Some players might find enjoyment in trying to find and learn every detail of a stage, so this does hinder that. But on the other hand, some players might start to do that and potentially bore themselves by not progressing, and this time limit forces them to keep moving. It also could, potentially, work against players who are trying to get 50 rings before completing a stage, so they can make it to a bonus stage. I'm imagining a scenario where players near the end of a stage gets hit, loses all of their rings, and then decides to backtrack in order to try and find as many rings as they can before returning to the end post. Sonic games do give players an incredibly lenient time limit of 10 minutes, with Sonic dying when the time runs out, so in the end, it shouldn't really hinder exploration all that much. The final element to the time though, is the faster players complete a stage, the more of a point bonus they'll get towards a score at the end, with every 50,000 points providing players with a 1-up. So definitely another element to entice players to finish stages faster. Although I do think typically trying to finish a stage quickly will lead to more deaths on the way, and potentially not making it to the bonus stages, as well as not finding hidden 1-ups throughout the stage. Your score does tally up over multiple stages, so you'll still get that 1-up bonus even if it takes you 5 acts to get it. But I don't know, this really never enticed me to finish a stage faster, personally speaking, and I do wonder how many people try to finish a stage faster for the sake of that 1-up. It's not bad or anything like that, I'm just not sure if it really worked the way the team might have envisioned in tempting players to finish stages faster and faster. By the time this ends up really being a boon to players, they'll probably be so good at the game and have mastered it so well, they don't even need those 1-ups. One more quick element I want to touch on is the in-game UI for Sonic. Here the team chose to emphasize the score, time, rings, and lives the player has. There's no fancy UI here to try and make things look nicer. It's really basic text at the top of the screen for most of the elements, with the lives being tucked away in the bottom corner. As players can add to their score by destroying enemies, it makes sense the team would have wanted players to visibly see the score the entire time. There are a few interesting choices with the UI, so let's talk about some alternate examples. Super Mario World has the UI spread across the entire top of the screen with mostly basic text. One of the inspirations to Sonic, Ghouls and Ghosts, has a similar UI but an additional element at the bottom showing the equipped weapon. Something common for the NES that would then transfer over to some 16-bit action games like Rocket Knight Adventures is a full UI bar that spreads across the screen. It limits how much of the action on screen players can see, but also makes it so the UI is always clear and easy to see, as the text will never bleed into the background. Then you have a game like Mega Man, where there's a health bar, but rather than traveling horizontally across the screen and taking up X real estate, the bar travels vertical, taking up Y real estate. It's also a little more stylized. Stylized UI is definitely how I would think of more modern UI behaving. Think of something like Hollow Knight, as it adds a nice visual flair. An equivalent in Sonic might be, instead of text saying rings, there's a visual animated ring spinning, and next to it is the number players have. The main things to think about with this sort of UI are A, how much information do we need to show? B, how do I make this information visible and easy to see? C, how do I show this information while still showing as much of the game as possible? And D, is there a way to design the UI to make it so it visually represents the tone and style of the game? While the visual UI bar of Hollow Knight is nice, a potential pitfall is that it can take up more room than simple text, so you might potentially be blocking more of the screen. The Rocket Knight Adventure style, or Shovel Knight example, makes the UI as clear as possible, but at the sacrifice of a giant portion of the game screen being completely cut off. Basic text like what Sonic has communicates what players need to know simply while still showing more of the screen, but it also doesn't have much style to it and doesn't really add to a feeling like, this is Sonic. Most of Sonic's UI is tucked into the top left of the screen, which usually doesn't matter as players are typically trying to progress to the right, but it still can get in the way during some circumstances. Sonic's lives being smaller and tucked into the bottom left tend to be hidden from the action a little bit better, in my opinion, because oftentimes that's where the ground beneath Sonic will be. In the case of Sonic though, as Sonic will be traveling both vertically and horizontally, and frequently, I don't think you'd want too much UI below Sonic, as players really do need to see where they're falling. While I do enjoy the more stylized modern version of UI, I really don't mind the basic text, but I do think the score could have been drastically shrunk down and maybe even moved to the bottom left below Sonic's lives. Ultimately, it's not very important, and mostly comes into play at the end of a stage, so I don't think there's any reason to emphasize it so much here. The final parts to this are the time and rings. I almost wonder if it would have been better to do something akin to Mario 1, where the timer was on the top right. So in this instance, maybe the rings would get shifted up to the top left of the screen and the timer to the top right. Now, you'd have far more action visible on the Y space of Sonic in general, but of course at the sacrifice of that little bit at the top right. There's no right answer to this, and you might think Sonic 1 handled its UI perfectly. For making it to the end of Green Hill Zone Act 3, players will come head to head with Dr. Robotnik for their first time. Robotnik will come in with a swinging ball that players will have to avoid as they have Sonic leap into Robotnik and bounce off. This is actually a really impressive and unique first boss design compared to, say, Sonic 2, where it's a car that moves back and forth trying to ram Sonic. This can be somewhat difficult for first-time players, as they'll have to figure out that it's more ideal to time out jumping into Robotnik as the ball is swinging towards them and fall through the connective rings, rather than jump into him when the ball is at the opposite end of the screen. At the same time, it's really not that hard when players get used to it, so it does become a pretty ideal first boss fight with a simple and easy pattern players can quickly master. Something interesting about this fight is that players who are either going fast or exploring can actually be rewarded for doing so by finding Invincibility just before this boss fight, completely trivializing it, which I think is totally fine for a first boss fight. It also helps reward players for going fast, which is a cool aspect to it. Another fun thing about this boss fight, as it is the introduction to Robotnik, is that right away it introduces a few key things to Robotnik. For one, it has a very clear obstacle in the swinging ball, communicating right away that players should be jumping into Robotnik's flying saucer, which will be his weak point, and this information will then be useful for every boss fight moving forwards. For two, it shows that Robotnik himself is weak, but he uses tools to fight back at Sonic, so it's some nice characterization right here at the start. With Robotnik defeated, players will make it to Marble Zone. Marble Zone is very different to Green Hill Zone, not just in its art and music, but also in its level design. So let's talk a bit about zones and acts in Sonic. Sonic's levels act more akin to Mario 1 or Ninja Gaiden, in that there are a number of acts within the same general stage, then the game moves on to a brand new stage with completely separate theming. Stepping back, every zone has 3 acts, with those acts ramping up in difficulty as they progress. Each zone has the same background, music, and general design philosophy. Green Hill Zone has roller coaster style levels, less frequent infinite death pits, multiple paths, and simple enemies or occasional spikes being the primary obstacle. There's a ramping difficulty to these 3 acts, with the third meant to be the most difficult, but all within this general level design philosophy. Next is Marble Zone. Marble Zone is a stage all about obstacles, and oftentimes, playing the floor is lava, literally. That means a lot more platforming, and Sonic not being able to utilize his speed very often, if at all. Also, there's really only one main path most of the time. Spring Yard Zone is the third level, with a lot of the stage based around things that will bounce Sonic. Sonic can still run fast at points, but there are far more obstacles and enemies, meaning that players should be playing a little slower. The fourth stage sees Sonic enter the Labyrinth Zone, which is Sonic's underwater level. Water acts to slow down Sonic a lot, but Sonic can only be underwater for a limited period of time before drowning. This means the stage is set up so players will need to play bite-sized moments quickly and effectively, stop, then play quickly and effectively again. Afterwards, Sonic will enter the Starlight Zone. The Starlight Zone is, like Green Hill Zone, a speedy roller coaster style level with multiple routes, but with far more danger. It feels like the natural evolution to Green Hill Zone with a difficulty ramp up. Finally, players will enter Scrap Brain Zone, which is far more obstacle based and like an evolution of Marble Zone. However, this time there are more frequent insta-death pits below Sonic, rather than the lava of Marble Zone, which didn't kill players, making Scrap Brain Zone far more dangerous in every way. So the team really tried to make every zone feel unique. The 3-act structure ramps up the difficulty, while the zones explore different ways to play with Sonic's gameplay and design. As these zones can be so different, it means that players will probably find different levels to be their favorites based on what they enjoy, and it helps to take away repetition. What's also interesting about the structure of Sonic is that while Mario was starting to evolve and utilize a map-based structure to its games, where they'd still be linear, but with a little bit of player choice added to it, Sonic maintains a strictly linear stage progression. The positive to a linear structure like this, as opposed to something more non-linear, is it means developers know exactly how the players will progress and can fine-tune the difficulty of that progression to allow for difficulty crescendos, but then also moments of ease to help bring down the tension. For example, after the incredibly stressful Labyrinth Zone, players enter a more fun and relaxed zone in the Starlight Zone, before another difficulty jump in Scrap Brain Zone. To me, it really speaks to the team trying to give players a break and a chance to gain more lives before another hard section. On the negative side, because Sonic is linear in structure, it also means that if players don't like something, say the switch to Marble Zone, they'll have to play it every time they boot up Sonic no matter what. The style to Marble Zone is different enough that it runs the risk of turning off a section of the player base who might have enjoyed the style of Green Hill Zone, but not the style of Marble Zone. There's no correct choice to this level structure or even level design here. It's really going to be about what the team felt was best and how it connects with each individual player. Some players will love the fine-tuned difficulty of a linear progression, while some will prefer a more non-linear structure a la Mario or Mega Man, where they can choose their own route. Some players will want a game where the gameplay is always something like Green Hill Zone or Starlight Zone, with speed and roller coaster stages, but never too much platforming or obstacles, while some will really enjoy the uniqueness of each zone and find that to be rewarding. So, with that, let's talk specifically about Zone 2 in Marble Zone. As I mentioned, Marble Zone is much more obstacle focused, with far less areas that Sonic can show off his speed. The acts frequently incorporate lava on the ground, meaning players will need to slow down and properly platform. There are smashing obstacles which will instantly kill Sonic if he's caught inside. Then, there are spiked ceilings that slam down, with a lot of obstacles being timer-based obstacles. Spikes that flip on and off to a timer, ceilings that slam down and then slowly come up on a timer, and platforms that Sonic will need to jump on which come in and out on a timer. Many of these obstacles are interesting because they don't play up Sonic's max speed factor at all. But when you think about it, they do still work for Sonic's speed in the sense of many of these are built around the concept of hurry and wait. A crushing platform is coming down, so you'll have to wait for the opportunity to pass it, hurry past it, then wait for the next one. A slamming spike is coming down, so wait for it to slam, then hurry as you vertically platform to a point where you can jump onto it and ride it up. Marble Zone is vastly more difficult than Green Hill Zone, and while elements of Green Hill Zone, like that Invincibility section I mentioned earlier, start to hint at what Marble Zone will be about, the stage really requires a lot more patience. I feel like this is a stage that probably turned off a lot of people to Sonic who might have been expecting more Green Hill Zone, But at the same time, as the game is about to have zones with very different structures, it probably is the best introduction to that evolving zone structure of Sonic, as it's still not too difficult compared to some of the levels that will be coming up. And just to my personal bias, as I really like the music and visuals here, maybe that also helps, for me, get into this stage. Marble Zone is so different to Green Hill Zone that it's now worth mentioning an interesting quote from Naoto Oshima. Some way into the project, Yuji and I were joined by Hirokazu Yasuhara, who further expanded upon our level design. One of the things I remember was Yuji and I removing some of the more difficult traps and obstacles that had been added by Mr. Yasuhara because we felt they detracted from the game's free-flowing sense of speed. However, Mr. Yasuhara would put the traps back in again the very next day. We went back and forth like this as days passed, which I feel resulted in a well-balanced game. It was an enjoyable process. Then, from Hirokazu Yasuhara, American audience and Japanese audiences are different. American audience feel the challenge is the most fun part of the video game, but Japanese audience want more casual gameplay elements. So I wanted to create a game for both countries' audiences. Not only the hardcore gamer, but the casual gamer also. So I think Marble Zone is the first time we really see these competing gameplay philosophies coming into play and perhaps clashing with each other. Green Hill Zone was about a free-flowing sense of speed, for the most part, which feels akin to what Yuji Naka and Naoto Oshima wanted out of Sonic, whereas Marble Zone is suddenly about stopping, slowing down, and approaching obstacles smartly, which seems more akin to what Hirokazu Yasuhara wanted Sonic to be about, or at least include. This is going to be another point where you'll probably find yourself agreeing with one side or the other. To my taste, I think I actually agree with Hirokazu Yasuhara, and think that if Sonic was entirely as free-flowing as Green Hill Zone and Starlight Zone, sure, the games would have been fun, but I think it would have run the risk of all blending together too much and not having enough challenge to really stand out. I think part of what makes Sonic a success, to me, is that each zone becomes so different and there ends up being a sense of speed mixed in with these interesting obstacles. While Sonic 1 isn't my favorite of the series, at all, Sonic 2 and Sonic 3 really expand on Sonic 1's overall gameplay philosophy and improve on it to my personal tastes. And something Sonic 2 and 3 have in common are that both Hirokazu Yasuhara and Yuji Naka worked on both of those games, meaning that they did have both of these design philosophies in place, and to my opinion, really improved on both, finding the right balance as they went on. Sonic CD, though, interestingly, only had Naoto Oshima working on it from the original trio and as the game director. From that quote about Sonic 1, Naoto Oshima was definitely more interested in the free-flowing sense of speed, and I think we see that a lot in Sonic CD, where there are far less platforming obstacles and a lot more ramps and even more routes, especially with the fact that you can time travel in Sonic CD, with the same stage including a past, present, bad future, and good future. With Sonic CD, Naoto Oshima also stated he wanted to include a lot more platforming and exploration aspects to the game, also trying to make the game more replayable. So to me, Sonic 2 and Sonic CD, as they were developed somewhat at the same time, are the perfect way to compare Hirokazu Yasuhara's influence on the Sonic games. To my taste, I far prefer Sonic 2 and Sonic 3 over Sonic CD, which I could be wrong here, but potentially shows that Hirokazu Yasuhara's design ideologies speak to me as a player more than Naoto Oshima's and perhaps Yuji Naka's. But if you prefer Sonic CD, you might find that the way Hirokazu Yasuhara likes to design games doesn't connect with you as much. I don't want to take away credit from Yuji Naka though, in terms of Sonic 2 and 3. It probably really comes down to the compromises and ideas between the team really coming together for something fantastic that spoke to me. All in all though, I think the combination and compromises of all three team members are really what led to the success of Sonic 1. I can definitely say that with the game I've been working on, while Alan and I agree on a lot, there are definitely times where one voice wins out over the other, or in many cases, we come to some compromise that works for both of us. And I think, similar to what Naoto Oshima expressed, that has led to our game becoming far better overall for it than anything I could have created on my own, and I really end up appreciating our collaboration, even if we do have some minor disagreements. One more state to Sonic is introduced in Marble Zone that I want to briefly touch on, and that's a push state. If Sonic runs up against the wall or an object, he'll begin trying to push it, with this specifically paying off in Marble Zone, with blocks Sonic can push in order to enter something. While this can be an interesting gameplay idea, specifically revolving around puzzles, I don't think it really does much here in Sonic 1 outside of slowing down the game. Yes, you can push a block onto a switch to raise a spiked chain, or a block onto lava to ride, or a block to enter a lava rush sequence, but I'm not sure if these are really enough to justify the mechanic in general. While the mechanic is nicely introduced in Marble Zone with the switch, and its uses in Marble Zone are okay, in one instance it'll activate the moving block over a lava sequence, and in the other I've referenced, it does serve as a way for players to visually see that the lava rush sequence is going to happen before it starts. I'm not sure if I personally think this mechanic is used enough to really pay off throughout the entirety of the game. It kind of feels like a forgotten feature rather than something the team really ended up utilizing. The one thing I will say about it is that when Sonic is running against the wall, it is a nice visual touch that he starts pushing, as opposed to looking like he's still running. Another thing that players will find in Marble Zone, somewhat similar to the breakable walls of Green Hill Zone, are these breakable ground sections. Like the breakable walls, they don't really do much other than add a nice visual flourish, and are something that would even be included in future Sonic games. Like the breakable walls, I really enjoy these, so much so that they actually served as an inspiration for how we handled the drillable ground in our own game, with us creating what I like to call a popcorn effect in how the ground busts open. That also leads to me talking about the art in general, because that's another area where we were influenced by Sonic. This isn't a hot take, but Sonic's art direction is absolutely fantastic. Before touching on Sonic himself, let's talk about the backgrounds. Here the colors start vivid and bright, showing a lively, vibrant, and happy place, before slowly introducing more brownish tones and grays as we traverse to the final stages, which are meant to look much more industrial, dark, dangerous, and sad. The color palette choices for these backgrounds speak volumes to how the team wants the player to feel, and the contrast between Green Hill Zone and Scrap Brain Zone is stark in the best way. Something I didn't notice as a kid, that I've now noticed in replaying these games for this video, is something I mentioned in the intro, and that's the absolutely insane amount of parallax scrolling going on in the background. That does make it so the lines between parallax scroll areas are more obvious when you actually look, so the background looks a little more disjointed, probably because the team couldn't properly do transparencies in the background, but it makes it so when the game is in motion, it really sings, and it brings Sonic's speed to the forefront. The stylized art of Sonic himself by Naoto Oshima is definitely a huge selling point of the game. Sonic looks both cute and cool at the same time, with some really great line work on his Hedgehog spikes naturally adding a nice amount of edge, while he still maintains some cutesy features, including the fact that his head is so big. It has elements of the cutesy chibi or super deformed style. To my understanding, chibi art has the head roughly half the size of the entire character. A child is typically drawn with their head being 1/4 of the entire character, whereas an adult's head is somewhere between 1/6 and 1/9 of the body size. Sonic's head in concept art makes up roughly half of his entire body, albeit maybe a little bit smaller than half. Comparing the sprites of Sonic to Robotnik, Robotnik's sprite has Robotnik's head make up roughly 1/5 of his body, although a little bit smaller, whereas Sonic's head size is half of his entire body. This makes Sonic look cute and young, and Robotnik look old and much more like a full-grown man, albeit still cartoonish as he still isn't proportioned normally. While Sonic has cute proportions, everything about his attitude is cool. From his intro animation waggling his finger at players, to his idle animation tapping his feet, glaring annoyed at players. It's a magical art design, and really, probably one of the best mascot designs around. For more on the art though, both on how the Sonic team handled art in its game and how it helped influence the game I'm working on, I'm going to turn this over to Alan, who's the art director and co-game director on our game.
Hey Dave, thanks for having me again. I'm a bit under the weather, so you'll have to forgive my low tone this time around. Or maybe everyone likes it better this way. I don't know. Anyway, the art direction for the original Sonic the Hedgehog was in direct response to the gaming landscape of the time, particularly to differentiate Sega from Nintendo's Mario. Sega wanted a mascot with attitude, visual flair, and broad appeal. And by broad appeal, I mean particularly in the US market. There's a lot that went into Sonic's character design. Really, none of it was accidental or just because it looked good. It all had purpose. To that point, Naoto Oshima and Yuji Naka crafted Sonic to be sleek, fast, and cool, which really embodied the rebellious spirit of the early 90s. His blue color was chosen to match Sega's logo, and even his red shoes were inspired by Michael Jackson's Bad album, apparently, and to contrast with his color scheme so you could see his legs running really, really fast. It made it really clear because it struck against the blue body and everything else. Reinforcing Dave's earlier statements, though, the environments, like Green Hill Zone, were designed to be bright, colorful, and organic, which contrast really nicely against the later stages of the mechanical, industrial zones that represented Dr. Robotnik. This created a visual dichotomy that reinforced the game's core theme: nature versus technology. When coming up with the initial concepts for Buzzbee, the main character for ChivalBee, Dave and I had a few things that we knew right out the gate. He needed to embody the vibe of what was cool when we were kids, but evolve that style of cool into something more modern. He also needed to have a face that could be cute, but also be very tenacious when he had to be. There were a few other influences involved in the process, but none shine as clearly as Oshima's. There's a lot I could talk about here. Honestly, I could do an entire video just on Buzzbee's character design, but I'll just round up this section by saying that ChivalBee's art direction pulls from Sonic and Studio Ghibli all the way to Resident Evil and Bloodborne. Designing for a game like this is exciting, and really it's a fascinating experience because you never know where inspiration is going to hit you and how you will apply it.
Coming along to another subjective element, let's talk about the music. Sonic's music was composed by Masato Nakamura, who was a bassist and songwriter for the J-pop band Dreams Come True. I find it to be pretty interesting they trusted the soundtrack to Nakamura, as, to me at least, J-pop music, and especially what I've heard from Dreams Come True, doesn't exactly scream video game music. To be clear, that's not a critique of Dreams Come True or Masato Nakamura. I just find it to be fascinating the team recognized Masato Nakamura would be a great match for Sonic, because in creating the music for Sonic, Nakamura would not only hit it out of the park for the game, but create some of the most iconic music in gaming, especially the Green Hill Zone theme. While I love Green Hill Zone, Marble Zone, and Labyrinth Zone songs, my personal favorite tracks are honestly the ones created for Sonic 2 and Sonic 3 and Knuckles, but that's just me. Either way, what's kind of interesting about a lot of the soundtrack is it's not this pulsating, driving music per se. It's really more thematic to the areas themselves, with a bit of a driving force to some of them, and I think that's what I like about them. It would have been easy to say, Sonic is fast, make the music pulsating and driving, but they didn't, so I think that's pretty cool. From making it to the end of Marble Zone, players will reach Dr. Robotnik in his Egg Scorcher. Here, Robotnik will fly back and forth between two platforms, dropping lava onto the ground, which will then spread out and temporarily set the entire platform on fire. In between the platforms is a bed of lava. So while the first boss in the Egg Wrecker tested players' timing and jumping, this is another boss that really tests players' ability to jump, with a bit of speed involved, as players will need to be regularly jumping from platform to platform. It's a pretty simple boss and not too challenging, but I think it gets the job done for Sonic. The game isn't really about combat, so a simple boss battle like this to test the player on jumping is really all I think you need, and it is a little more difficult than the first boss. For defeating the Egg Scorcher, players will reach the third stage, Spring Yard Zone. The main conceit of Spring Yard Zone is, as per its name, springs, as well as some added bumpers to change things up. It seems to be the real level where the team said, hey, we have this interesting mechanic in springs that launch Sonic, let's make a level designed around that. To that end, I think there probably could have been more springs for a stage called Spring Yard Zone, and maybe interesting spring sequences that we really don't see here. Don't get me wrong, the level is fine and has some really clever ideas. In particular, I love these half-pipes with spiked balls traveling around them that really play into Sonic's acceleration and the unique level design of the game, but I do think the level might have benefited from a broader use of the springs. Honestly, as I played Sonic 2 as a kid around the same time I'd play Sonic 1, it was hard for me not to look at Spring Yard Zone as a less refined version of Sonic 2's Casino Night Zone, which is totally unfair as this is the first game. But I think what that really speaks to, at least to me, is that Spring Yard Zone had a good concept that wasn't fully explored, and that concept would be better explored in future titles. Spring Yard Zone is another pretty steep ramp up in difficulty compared to the previous stages, with several spike traps throughout that will absolutely take out players for going too fast and not paying attention, as well as one of the more difficult enemies in Sonic 1, the roller. These rollers will quickly roll behind Sonic during certain sections, and are invulnerable when rolling, kind of making them scary surprise attack enemies. This stage also introduces these Hermit Crab Spikes Badniks, who are kind of a leveled up version of the spiked Caterkillers of Marble Zone, whereas the Caterkiller should really be killed by rolling into it as its back is spiky, the head isn't, so players could still jump on them. The spikes though can only be killed by rolling into them, which I think is a great enemy, as it forces players to really use their full moveset if they want to safely destroy them. Overall, I do think the stage is a decent challenge ramp up with some clever enemies and obstacles, with the stage absolutely filled with different types of spike challenges players will need to deal with. This stage really reconfirms the overall design idea behind Sonic, which is that all of the enemies overall are pretty simple. The true challenges in Sonic come from its level design and various traps or obstacles players will need to deal with, and the enemies themselves feel more like obstacles. If I'm being honest though, I always personally found Spring Yard Zone to be somewhat forgettable. It's probably because it didn't play as much into the springs or bumpers it introduces as much as it could have. Even if you've been playing well overall, Spring Yard Zone is a stage designed to make players accidentally run too fast and hit spikes. To that end, if you hadn't before, this very well could be the stage players end up dying, so it's time for me to bring up the death mechanics in Sonic. If Sonic is hit with no rings or falls into an insta-death pit, Sonic will enter a death state. No matter how Sonic dies, this makes his sprite go into a static shocked image while the player bounces up then down off of the screen. At the same time, the screen behind Sonic will pause. It's a clever way to handle a death for a number of reasons. For one, as Sonic travels off of the screen, it means the team doesn't have to worry about colliders at all. For example, if Sonic dies in the air, well, the team doesn't have to worry about how he's going to fall, then hit the ground. It's simple, so there's no programming or bugs to worry about, and as Sonic is quickly popping up and down, it's one less animation the team had to worry about. The team also chose to pause the action in the background, which is a nice way to quickly make it clear something changed, even though the music is still playing. Finally, because this game was made for kids, if Sonic had a dark animated death, well, you'd never know how parents might have reacted, even though Sonic was released before the creation of the ESRB. What's even more clever is how deaths are handled for enemies. All of the enemies are robots, so to that end, the team made it so there's a sound effect and a poof explosion animation as soon as an enemy is destroyed, creating consistency and a quick way for players to understand, I killed the thing, move on. On top of that, because every enemy is destroyed the same way, that's far less animations the team needs to worry about creating, saving a whole lot of time. They also cleverly snuck in a bit of world building here. For destroying one of the robots, a cute little animal will pop out and hop away. This immediately tells a story. Sonic isn't bad, what he's destroying are just robots, and in doing so, he's saving animals. Before players even reach the end of the stage, it tells you exactly why Sonic is probably on his quest. Not only that, but it tells us that Robotnik's robots are created by putting animal life into them. It does also make it a little sad for any robot you don't destroy by the end of the stage, as I kinda imagine the cute creatures are still stuck inside, but you know, can't save them all, I guess. That also leads to what happens when players defeat Robotnik. For completing 3 acts and destroying whatever boss fight you're up against, Sonic will reach a capsule that players will need to jump on and destroy, which in turn releases a huge amount of innocent little captured animals who are probably on their way to be unwillingly transformed into robots. Again, just a great moment of world building at the end of each stage, really establishing just how much of a villain Robotnik is. Something I should also briefly mention are the goalposts at the end of each act that doesn't have a boss. To complete an act, Sonic will need to run into these goal plates, which will then spin and change the image from Robotnik to Sonic. it's a nice visual touch that once again emphasizes the idea of speed, with the idea being Sonic runs so fast, it spins this goalpost around and around. So just another thoughtful bit from the team, who are definitely thinking about all of the ways they could emphasize Sonic's characteristic of being fast. As I've been going over death states, that does lead to a major mechanic of Sonic the Hedgehog, and a mechanic that was a regular feature of all platform games of the time, and that's a lives and continue system. Sonic will begin with a set number of lives, and should you run out of those lives, it's game over. Interestingly, while some games were starting to include infinite continues, Sonic 1 gives players 0 continues to start, with continues only being earned in bonus stages. This means that both 1-ups and continues mean far more in Sonic than many other games, because if you get a game over, that's it. You're going all the way back to the start of the game. In fact, because of this, I don't even know when I beat Sonic 1, as I definitely wasn't able to beat it when I first started playing it as a kid. I discussed the lives, continue, and game over system quite a bit in my Mega Man 1 video, so I don't want to retread too much here, but suffice to say, it's a mechanic that's generally speaking considered a little outdated, as it can be such a huge annoyance to get a game over and need to replay everything all over again. But you would want to punish a player somehow for messing up, otherwise there's no consequence for losing the game, which is why the corpse run system Dark Souls used has become so popular, which was used in games like Shovel Knight, as in this system, players will lose some sort of currency and only a minor amount of progress, but with a chance to regain that currency. The positive though, to the lives, continue, and game over system, is that it both creates added tension to moments and makes both 1-ups and continues all that much more exciting to find or earn. In a game like Sonic, which can be difficult and a game over is it, that means every 1-up players find is a huge deal, and finding a 1-up is actually meaningful. It also makes that score reaching 50,000 giving players a 1-up also mean something, or collecting 100 rings for a 1-up, because lives are that limited. It also gives the bonus stages extra meaning beyond the super difficult Chaos Emerald players will be trying to find, as even if players fail, if they manage to obtain 50 rings in a bonus stage, they'll earn a continue. Having limited lives also drastically raises the tension when players have 0 left and are close to a game over, and that tension can be something some players really enjoy, as overcoming moments while things are that tense can be so much more rewarding. On top of that, it makes completing the game feel like that much more of an accomplishment. And really, everything around the game is designed around this concept of lives. As Yuji Naka talked about, he wanted players to be able to complete stages faster and faster as they improved. So the idea is that a player might make it to Marble Zone, lose, but then be slightly better and be able to complete Green Hill Zone a little more efficiently and make it back to where they were a little faster. Most stages have multiple routes, so even there, players will eventually find the route that's the most efficient. Completing a stage quickly results in a higher score, meaning more points, meaning a more likely 1-up. Players probably won't know there are special zones in their first playthrough, but eventually as they become better, find one of those special zones, and discover you can unlock a continue in it, helping players make a little more progression on that playthrough. So while yes, repeating everything if you get a game over can be annoying, the game is supposed to be about players improving, learning the stages, and being able to make it back to where they were quicker and quicker, which is part of the fun. Either way, it's definitely not every player's cup of tea, which is why in Sonic Origins Anniversary Mode, players are given infinite lives and 1-ups are replaced with coins which can be used to reattempt bonus stages for Chaos Emeralds. Neither approach is wrong or bad. It really depends on what type of experience the developers want the players to have and how difficult they want their game to feel. And to that end, I leave it to you to let me know which approach you prefer for Sonic. If a player needs to use a continue, they'll restart at the beginning of the act they needed to use the continue at, so that leads to how lives act differently in Sonic. As Sonic stages are pretty long, the stages also include several checkpoints, with those checkpoints only activating if Sonic crosses them. These checkpoints act as the place players will restart if they die, and not only make it so players won't have to replay as much, making death not quite so punishing, but also help distinguish lives from continues. They're a great feature, and the team seemed to do a good job of balancing the checkpoints so there weren't too many, which can really destroy any sort of tension, but also enough checkpoints where players won't be too frustrated and dying. It can be a difficult balance to achieve, I imagine. Before coming to the boss of Spring Yard Zone, one more thing I mentioned were those bonus stages, or special stages. If players find and hold on to 50 rings before crossing the goal plate of an act without a boss, a ring will appear at the end of the stage players can jump into in order to reach Sonic 1's special stages. These stages are constantly rotating mazes, with Sonic needing to roll and hop along the ground, or bumpers, to try and make it to a Chaos Emerald. If players hit the flashing goal platforms, they'll lose and be transported out. Definitely the wrong name for something bad, as goal sounds like something you want to get to. I think this should have been retranslated to stop or something like that. There are a number of elements to these special stages that make them more interesting. Bumpers that will bump the player in, well, a good or bad way. Transparent jump stand blocks which Sonic can temporarily pass through before they become solid. Diamonds that Sonic will have to chip away at in order to progress, or reverses, which, as the name suggests, reverse the direction of the spinning of the stage. I'm not sure how the team came up with the special stages, but given its rotation and the fact that was probably something the NES couldn't do, I do wonder if part of this was to show off the power of the Sega Genesis, while the other element to it, with its spinning and constantly changing how Sonic's momentum would work, specifically with the idea in mind that they could show off their unique physics system. When you think about it that way, and all of the physics calculations that were probably constantly taking place, it's actually a pretty impressive bonus stage. That said, I hate these stages. I think there's far too much of an element to luck here. If you don't know the layout, it's easy to accidentally end up going the wrong way and ending up at a goal because you didn't know it existed. Even if you know where you want to go, there's a good chance a bumper will send Sonic careening in the wrong direction, or there's a reverse button in the way that will absolutely screw you over. While I always desperately wanted every Chaos Emerald in Sonic 1, I don't think I ever actually achieved this as a kid, and I actually find these stages more difficult than the main game. While I'm impressed with the physics of these stages, from a gameplay standpoint, it's hard for me to find positives, as I simply think players are far too out of control of what's happening. While the general concept isn't great, if there are more indicators as to where the bad goals were and players knew these were coming, I think that would have been one factor to significantly save on player frustration here. One more thing that I want to talk about with these is that players will need 50 rings by the end of an act in order to make it to a special stage. That requires players to complete levels with a little more skill and without getting hit, but I honestly find it to be a little frustrating, as one mistake, especially later on, can cost you pretty dearly. And as this is a game that's supposed to be about playing more and more efficiently and completing stages faster and faster, is this idea really a boon to that concept? If players are attempting to complete a stage quickly, it's pretty likely they won't collect 50 rings. But collecting 50 rings is the only way to enter a special stage for a Chaos Emerald. That makes the game feel a little bit more about exploration in some ways, which is what Naoto Oshima wanted to emphasize for Sonic CD, and is in some ways what Sonic 3 would also really be about. So it feels like a competing gameplay philosophy coming into play here. Your reward for finishing a special stage is a Chaos Emerald. There are 6 total Chaos Emeralds in Sonic the Hedgehog 1, so technically, if you play perfectly, it's here in Spring Yard Zone Act 2 where players will be able to find their final Chaos Emerald. That said, unlike future Sonic games, Super Sonic hadn't been introduced in Sonic 1, so players don't actually unlock anything here for finding all of the Chaos Emeralds. Rather, finding all 6 by the end of the game will unlock the good ending. Make it to the end of Spring Yard Zone, and players will reach Dr. Robotnik in his Egg Stinger. Here, Robotnik will move back and forth in the air, before occasionally moving down with a spike, which will of course hurt players if Sonic touches it, and pull out the ground from beneath him, destroying it. It's a cool concept, with there being this idea of a looming time limit where Sonic will need to destroy Robotnik before all of the ground beneath him is gone. That's easy enough to do, but it still feels pretty intense, and puts the focus of this boss fight on platforming, maintaining that general concept of Sonic. For defeating the Egg Stinger, players will make it to the 4th stage, Labyrinth Zone. But before I really delve into Labyrinth Zone, it's worth discussing an important mechanic the zone introduces, and that's in how Sonic handles its water mechanic. The way Sonic handles water feels pretty unique to me, and it's a direction that I hadn't seen in prior platform games. When in water, Sonic moves far slower. He can only be underwater for a limited amount of time before he needs air, meaning players will need to either jump out of the water to refill their invisible air meter, or find a bubble which will do the same. If players do run out of air, they'll drown and die. However, outside of moving far slower, Sonic's moveset is the exact same as when he's out of the water. Some other water mechanic examples include Mario, which has it so players enter a very specific swimming state, which acts different to normal platforming, Castlevania, where the water is just a visual gimmick for another infinite death pit, or Mega Man, where Mega Man can jump far higher while in water, but otherwise acts the same. So the question is, was this slow movement a good way to handle water in Sonic? I can see the idea behind it. Sonic moves fast, so introduce an obstacle that slows him down. People move slow in water, so this seems like a pretty natural fit. To that end, I can't blame the team for coming up with this mechanic, as it does in theory work as a good obstacle playing against what players have come to expect. The fact that Sonic has limited air helps to maintain the idea of speed. Yes, Sonic moves slow in water, but players will need to move as fast as they can, even underwater, in between air sections, so it creates these nice little bursts of that gotta go fast feeling. So to that extent, I think the way water was handled in the Sonic games is pretty clever. There are some quotes from the team in the Sonic Jam Japanese official guidebook, which was translated by fans, specifically discussing the water mechanic. From these quotes, it sounds like Yuji Naka and the team intentionally made the water slow down players to work as a break from the normal high-speed action, as they weren't sure if players might get burnt out from the action. They also had Sonic sink in water to act as a sort of weakness for Sonic. All of that is fine, but where I find issue is in how water is used. I think this mechanic works when it's either a trap or punishment, or it's in its smaller spurts. As Sonic moves at such a sluggish pace when he's in water, for me at least, it really takes away a lot of the fun of this character. The different type of challenge is clever, yes, and it's nice when the team thoughtfully builds stages around their mechanics, but I'm not sure if I really enjoy playing giant multi-level sequences of Sonic moving sluggish, which takes me right to Labyrinth Zone. But for real this time. Whereas Spring Yard Zone felt like a bit of a continuation on the ideas of Green Hill Zone, with multiple paths and a whole lot of things to make Sonic go fast, Labyrinth Zone feels more like a continuation of the ideas from Marble Zone. The stage is a large sequence of slow-moving obstacles, albeit with a little bit more in terms of multiple routes. The first section acts as a nice introduction to the water mechanic. After a couple shallow water teases, players will be thrown right into deep water, with tempting coins and a switch meant to slow players down. Immediately following this area are two bubble spouts right by each other, and even a switch to escape. Between all of these, it's inevitable that players will at some point start to run out of air, but technically could make it through without filling up. It means that players who are brand new to the mechanic won't find themselves trapped, as there are so many air solutions right by. The next underwater sequence is also nicely designed, with plenty of bubbles everywhere, with players needing to find the right switch to press in order to progress. I think it's pretty important to put all of the bubbles here, not just because it's the beginning of the stage, but because the first section makes it possible for players to escape the water without filling up on air through a bubble. So with the bubbles everywhere here as players are searching for that switch, it makes it not only inevitable new players will end up needing to use a bubble for air here, but pretty easy for them to accidentally jump into one and note, oh, Sonic gasped for air, I guess that's how you fill up. Beyond that, we're going to come across various spike and switch challenges, which are really going to make up the bulk of most of these stages. Yes, there's the occasional enemy, but for the most part, they're really just another obstacle in the way, but one that happens to be moving Sonic can destroy. On an individual level, all of the sections of the stage seem well designed to me, with a nice sequence of individual challenges. From spears that shoot in and out players will need to time out running through, to moving platforms players will need to ride, and hidden switch sequences that add a light puzzle element. There are also well-designed vertical climb challenges involving timing out jumps with swinging spikes, which wouldn't be too difficult on its own, but becomes more stressful thanks to the underwater air timer. My main issue with Labyrinth Zone, as I alluded to before, is that all 3 acts primarily take place underwater, meaning that Sonic is running at that slow, sluggish speed. It makes all of these levels really drag, and with the drowning death mechanic, makes this perhaps the largest difficulty ramp up in the entire game. It's fascinating then to find out from Sega Saturn's Sonic Jam that the initial level order of the games were swapped to account for difficulty, and Labyrinth Zone was actually originally meant to be the second stage players would go to, not Marble Zone. I am so glad they pushed this one back. At least in my daycare, not everyone was able to make it to Labyrinth Zone in the first place, but at least because a number of more fun stages where Sonic can move normally were placed first, it gives players a chance to really fall in love with Sonic before this far more challenging level where Sonic moves at such a sluggish pace. And really, I don't mind the water mechanics or individual elements of this stage, it's just too much all at once for me. I really like Sonic 2's Aquatic Ruin Zone, where there's water but it's only in the bottom path, and I absolutely love Sonic 3's Hydro City Zone, I'm not sure of the correct pronunciation, which definitely includes underwater sections, but plenty of fun speedy above water sections in between. But I'm sure I'm not alone in saying Labyrinth Zone is my least favorite stage of Sonic 1, and perhaps one of my least favorite Sonic stages of any of the classic Sonic games. Make it through Labyrinth Zone, and players will reach Robotnik in a pretty unique boss fight where he'll be riding in the Eggmobile. This is a bit of a trick boss fight where players are supposed to chase Robotnik up an extra difficult vertical sequence of Labyrinth Zone, but with water slowly rising and catching up, meaning a very good chance players will drown and die if they play too slow or mess up too many times. Messing up here also means players will be getting hurt and potentially dying from traps before ever risking drowning, as this section is really more of a trick meant to make players feel rushed when they should be taking their time to slowly make it through each trap without taking damage. In the end, players will never be able to destroy the Eggmobile, and really, the entire quote-unquote boss fight is a platforming challenge where the Eggmobile doesn't matter at all. That's all fine and good, but to that end, I'm not sure how I feel about the fact that the entire section starts with players jumping into and landing a hit on Robotnik. To me, this makes it feel like players are supposed to be destroying Robotnik's Eggmobile under a time limit, and before water potentially catches up to the player. The Eggmobile is always just a little out of reach during the climb, with it speeding up extra fast when Sonic gets a little too close, so I think not being able to hit Robotnik, even in the first place, might have prevented that potential confusion. Funny enough, even though you're not actually fighting Robotnik here, and it really is just a straight platforming challenge, I think this is the most difficult Robotnik fight in the entire game, as the climb can be a little tricky. For completing the Labyrinth Zone, it's time for a bit of a break as players will reach the Starlight Zone. Starlight Zone is probably the level I'd equate to being the most similar to Green Hill Zone in terms of its overall design philosophy. There are plenty of different routes players can choose to take, many sections are truly centered on speed, routes are designed similar to roller coasters with the return of loops, and there's even a breakable wall. There are more difficult enemies here than Green Hill Zone, with the only enemies in this stage being the Orbinauts, who are surrounded by spikes and are really more of a simple moving obstacle, and these bombs, who will explode creating some falling projectiles. In general, the obstacles are far more difficult than those of Green Hill Zone, with obstacles like fireball shooting turrets. When there's moving platforms, they're a little more complex than Green Hill Zone, and whereas most of the bottom of Green Hill Zone was ground, Starlight Zone has far more insta-death pits, although they're pretty easy to avoid so long as players stick to the top path. Starlight Zone also introduces this fun obstacle in these teeter-totters with a spiked ball on one end. Players can use these to launch Sonic higher and higher into the air, making for yet another fun and clever way to vertically traverse. To my understanding, before the level restructure based on difficulty, it's likely that Starlight Zone was originally intended to be the 4th stage Sonic would come to, although in this case it's the 5th and second to last. Purely in terms of difficulty, I honestly feel like this might have been better suited as the second level, but at the same time, it does serve as a nice reprieve between Labyrinth Zone and Scrap Brain Zone, which are by far the 2 most difficult stages in the game. So it actually creates a nice rhythm to the stage progression, almost like a song or film, where the stages slowly ramp up in difficulty, then players get a small reprieve here before the final act. It also means that the style of stages are really well mixed up. If Green Hill Zone were followed by Starlight Zone, then Spring Yard Zone, with the final 3 stages being Marble Zone, Labyrinth Zone, and then Scrap Brain Zone, it might have felt like a bit of tonal whiplash on the back half of the game when players are thrown from free-flowing movement stages into slower, obstacle-heavy stages. Something I haven't talked about yet, but want to briefly touch on, are the various power-ups that Sonic can find throughout Sonic 1. These include the Shield, Invincibility, and Power Sneakers, or High Speed. The shield does exactly what it says, and forms a protective barrier around Sonic. It acts as an extra bit of health, and importantly, will protect Sonic from losing his rings if he's hit with the shield. It's a great basic power-up concept for Sonic. The second power-up is in Invincibility. Here, some special music will play, and Sonic can run into enemies with no fear while it plays. Really, it acts just like a superstar from Super Mario Bros. The song is a great touch that helps indicate to players how long the power-up will last and when it will run out. The only critique I really have is that, while I do love that music cue, it doesn't work for people hard of hearing or deaf. So it might have been nice to include some sort of visual indicator right before the ability is about to end. Finally, there's the Power Sneakers, or High Speed. While they last, these sneakers will send Sonic flying through a stage, jacking up both his acceleration and max speed. It also increases the pace of the music playing in the background, which is a nice touch. That said, this is the one ability that I find a lot of fault in. It's already difficult enough to control Sonic when he's going max speed and not run into any obstacles. So in some ways, this really acts far more as a hindrance than something actually useful. It's a good concept, and I get it. Sonic runs fast, the game is about speed, so how about a power-up that makes him move even faster? But in the way that the games are designed with obstacles everywhere, I really don't think this one works in the end. Maybe for speedrunners this is a nice tool, but I don't think most players will be mastering the game to the point where this becomes at all useful. There's nothing wrong with including an ability like this, but I do wonder if perhaps there could have been something more useful, like perhaps the ability to briefly run on spikes, or maybe in the Labyrinth Zone, something similar to the bubble from Sonic 3, but that lasts for a limited amount of time, allowing for players to move faster by not needing to stop for air. For making it through Starlight Zone, players will reach Robotnik in his Egg Spiker. Here, those seesaws found throughout the stage become the entire idea behind the boss sequence, with the Egg Spiker dropping spiky bombs onto the seesaws, which Sonic can either launch back up at Robotnik, or, just like in the stage, players can use the weight of the bombs to launch Sonic at Robotnik. It makes for a pretty simple fight, but one that's a lot of fun thanks to how unique it is. It's also nice to see this combat usage of the teeter-totters. This is one of those types of fights that could become really slow and tedious, as players are constantly waiting for Robotnik to drop his bombs in order to be able to do something. But fortunately, the team has Robotnik dropping bombs so frequently, it helps keep up the pacing of the boss fight, and also helps to make it slightly more difficult, as that also means there's more things on the screen at once that can hurt Sonic. After defeating the Egg Spiker, players will reach the final zone, Scrap Brain Zone. Scrap Brain Zone is by far the most challenging stage of the bunch, which is fitting as it's the final one. And interestingly, while the first 2 acts are obstacle-heavy stages, the third act becomes a reprieve of the Labyrinth Zone, with Robotnik tricking Sonic with a trap, bringing Sonic to a watery lair. Of the 3 acts, Act 1 seems to be most centered around timing-based platform challenges. Platforms that will occasionally spin and drop Sonic are introduced, as well as platforms that appear and disappear on a timer. There are still multiple paths players can take, and while this can certainly be challenging at times, it feels like an appropriate build-up to test players on their platforming prowess. Act 2 of Scrap Brain Zone will take players inside, and, to my opinion, is by far the most challenging stage in Sonic 1. While there are occasional platforming moments, the act is absolutely filled with spikes, fire, lightning, buzzsaws, and smashing platforms that can instantly kill Sonic if he's pinned inside. Many of these obstacles are tied together with treaded platforms that will push Sonic in one direction or the other, far upping how difficult the challenges are. While these types of treaded platforms are present in many other platform games, like Mega Man, Sonic's extreme acceleration and deceleration makes them far more difficult to navigate and verges on feeling unfair, to me, as you might need to run quickly to avoid a spiked mace on a platform heading one direction, but then shoot out onto a treaded platform going the other direction without enough time to use Sonic's deceleration to properly slow down. Although this is the final zone of the game, and this stage, to me, feels like the true climax, so to that end, I think this difficulty is justified. Act 2 also introduces this cool concept in these spinning wheels Sonic can attach to with his momentum, and then time out jumping at the correct angle in order to progress. It's a clever concept playing with the idea that Sonic is fast enough to run around these, and it introduces a great gameplay idea. In fact, it's such a strong concept, I really wish it had been explored further in Scrap Brain Zone, as the sections that use these are simple, low consequence areas, but it feels like a great timing challenge that could have been elaborated on with enemies, obstacles, and/or death pits. Act 3 begins with Robotnik dropping Sonic down into what basically amounts to Labyrinth Zone Act 4. It's the same premise as Labyrinth Zone in every way, so it's a bit of a shame it didn't take any concepts from other stages to mix in, which would have created a much more interesting act. The act is okay, I suppose, but I do think something that was either original in its traps or a culmination of everything players had seen before would have served as a better final act, as this will be the end. Beyond the fun idea of Robotnik having this trap for Sonic, it does make sense in that the other truly difficult mechanic of Sonic is this water mechanic. So when you look at Scrap Brain Zone as a whole, rather than act by act, there's challenging platform sequences, challenging obstacles, and then a challenging water sequence, so altogether, it does round off testing the players on all of the major mechanics throughout the game. If players do manage to make it past Scrap Brain Zone, or input the password to simply skip to the final stage, as kids in my daycare would do, players will reach the final zone, which is simply a Dr. Robotnik fight. Here, players will square off against Robotnik in his Egg Crusher. 4 crushing units make up the middle of the stage, with the boss following a simple pattern. 2 crushers will slam against the ground or roof, with Robotnik hiding inside one of them. Then, 4 projectiles will appear from a laser light bulb above that will slowly track down towards the ground. Sonic gets no rings in this boss fight, and will need to quickly react to which crusher contains Robotnik and jump or roll into him. One false step will result in Sonic being crushed or killed by a projectile. The idea behind this fight seems to be around quick reaction, with players needing to quickly react to which crushers are slamming in order to avoid them, then quickly react to which pod has Robotnik in it in order to actually hurt him and win the fight. Although, players can also take it easy on one of the sides, where they'll be safe from the slammers, but have less opportunities to strike at Robotnik. I think the concept of this fight is fine, and I don't mind that the player gets no rings for this final fight, but Sonic's acceleration begins so slow, it makes it feel too slow to really properly react in time to the Egg Crushers if 2 of them happen to slam next to each other in the area Sonic is standing. It is, of course, possible, but it feels a little too close for comfort to feel particularly fun to me, subjectively. My other issue with this boss fight is that it doesn't really feel like it tests the player on anything the game was really about. Sure, avoiding projectiles is fine, but there's no platforming, there's no quick speed, it's just slowly move out of the way of the platform slamming, and then jump in the middle of the sparks to best avoid them. I do like the fact that, once again, Robotnik is using a tool in order to defeat Sonic, but to my opinion, future games do a better job by really increasing the wow factor of the final fight. After defeating Robotnik, he'll attempt to escape in his Eggmobile. While players can jump into it, giving a satisfying moment as it blows up, Robotnik still escapes, and interestingly, you can actually let it go without hitting it, which doesn't affect the ending at all, as far as I can tell. We then see Sonic run back to Green Hill Zone with animals he'd saved throughout the stages, excitedly bouncing around everywhere, and a cool animation of Sonic jumping into the screen. If players don't find all of the Chaos Emeralds, they'll get the bad ending, with this being it, and after the credits, text saying, "Try again," as Robotnik juggles however many Chaos Emeralds the player missed. But, if the players do collect every Chaos Emerald, Robotnik will instead be jumping on the text "end" in frustration, and prior to that, after returning to the animals in Green Hill Zone, the Chaos Emeralds will spin around and make giant flowers appear. It's nothing major, but a nice little additional touch for completing everything in the game. And roll the credits. I know I spent most of this video covering the basic mechanics of Sonic 1, rather than necessarily level design, but I think those basic mechanics are what really set the foundation for the entire franchise, and are why Sonic was such a success. Everyone's favorite Sonic game is going to differ, and Sonic 1 doesn't happen to have my favorite stages or music. It's a game that feels like it has a lot of great ideas that aren't fully refined yet. While Green Hill Zone acts as the perfect opening act to Sonic 1, Marble Zone and Labyrinth Zone have interesting ideas, but are a little too slow paced without enough variation in routes for what I think makes the perfect Sonic levels. Starlight Zone is a nice in-between stage, but nothing stands out too much to me about it other than it being a reprieve. And then Spring Yard Zone and Scrap Brain Zone have some great ideas that I think are explored a little better in future titles. In general, I think some of the level design ideas that are in place for Sonic 1 are really clever, like in having multiple viable routes, but will be really mastered in future titles. And similarly, to my taste, I think the team really improved on the concept for their special stages in future titles. But for a first entry, Sonic 1 absolutely makes a mark, and there's a reason it stood out amongst its contemporaries. The physics detection with all of the ramps and loops is incredibly clever, and the way the game manages to give players such a great sense of speed, along with its roller coaster design, has a unique and incredible game feel. I also think the get hit and ring system was incredibly clever, and a great way to handle taking damage in Sonic. So what are your impressions of Sonic 1, and what is your favorite of the classic Sonic games? Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, I've been slowly working on making videos like this on the entire classic Mega Man franchise from 1 to 11, and just recently completed my episode on Mega Man 7. I also have a design breakdown from years ago on Dark Souls 1. If you'd like to see more episodes on Sonic, let me know. Finally, as I've referenced several times in this video, I'm working on a game, ChivalBee. It's a 2D mascot action platform game with a bounce mechanic inspired by Castlevania Symphony of the Night, non-linear design inspired by Mega Man, and a bit of art direction inspired by Sonic. If it looks at all interesting to you, we'd love if you followed our company account, Ophidian Interactive, on either YouTube or social media for cool updates as we have them. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace.